Good morning. If you could come in and take your seats, we will soon start. You're attending the CounterInsurgency panel, and the panelists really need no introduction. They're all household names, people that we read about for certain. We have Congressman Jane Harman, who is from the 36th District in California, who is a central leader in the House on intelligence and Homeland Security issues. We have Michael Chertoff, the former Homeland Security Secretary. We have General Jack Keane, who is a former U.S. Army's Chief of Staff. And we have Mike McConnell, who is the Senior Vice President for Homeland Security at Booz Allen. Our moderator is Fred Kaplan, who is best known to most of us as a war stories columnist for Slate magazine. And Fred has written prolifically on politics and culture. So thank you for attending the session. It's over to you, Mike.
Okay, well, thanks for being here. This is a very broad topic, and we have a very little amount of time. So I've prohibited the panel from making long opening speeches and hope that we can get into some conversation and even some debate. And preeminent and prominent as these people are, I'll try to get them to say what they really believe about some things. If you read the booklet, it said, it talked about how in today's world, weak states are more dangerous than strong states, and that we're going to be spending a lot of our effort in military and foreign policy dealing with battling insurgencies around the world. And I guess the first question I'd like to ask would be of Mike McConnell, who is also, it should be noted, was the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the National Security Agency, and the Intel Director during Desert Storm. Desert Storm, right? So he's got about 50 clearances banging around in his head. Is this assumption true? All right, looking at the threat board, or whatever you want to call it, are the biggest threats, in fact, weak nations, not strong nations? Or to put it more in the context of this thing, are we ever going to fight, not ever, that's a long word, say in the next decade, are we likely to fight big wars again, or even high-intensity wars against powers? Or is this wars like Iraq, Afghanistan, things like that?
Well, Fred, I'd like to give you a good answer, but that's classified. So
You'll have to kill everybody after.
Actually, the Joint Forces Command, who is responsible in the Department of Defense for thinking about the future and planning for the future and so on, is having this dialogue and debate right now. The dilemma is being prepared for general war, a la Cold War, a la World War II, versus what we're more likely to face, and how do you achieve balance? In the history of warfare, adversaries will adopt a profile or a process to attack the weakness of their perceived enemy, and that's what we're facing today. So my view is we will see groups, insurgent groups, extremist groups, those with a particular orientation or point of view who do not have power, try to use modern technology to their advantage for coordination, for weapons, to have dramatic impact to influence populations. So I think what I'm describing is terrorism and the thinking of terrorism. And so whether you call it a terrorist activity or insurgency or counterinsurgency, I think this is going to be predominant in our future for some time. The question is, how do we prepare for it and how do we react to it?
Okay, well, this leads to a question for General Keane, who, among other things, was also very much involved in the formulation of this, what is called the surge strategy in Iraq. It actually had a lot more to do than with just putting in more forces. But that being the case, what Mr. McConnell was saying, do we now have the right balance of armed forces? Looking, for example, at Secretary Gates's budget, which puts more of an emphasis on counterinsurgency than any other budget before has. Do we have the right kind of balance? And even, is there that much of a distinction between fighting insurgents and fighting other kind of powers? I've read reports anyway that the Taliban and other insurgent groups are getting very good at conventional kinds of battles.
Yeah. Well, let me add first to something Mike said. When I look at this, if you think of the 20th century, international security and strife was pretty much resident in Europe. And in the 21st century, that's moved east, and it's moved east to the Levant on the western part of the Middle East, all the way over to Indonesia and North Africa. And in that area, we have significant national security interests and significant economic interests. Transnational groups reside there. Every Arab Muslim nation has a jihadist, radical Islamic movement in it, and we were attacked from there. We've already fought 4 wars there, 2 in Iraq, a minor one in Somalia, and also now what's taken place in Afghanistan. In my own view, we will be there for 20 or 30 years, mostly trying to prevent war, trying to change the conditions which are contributing to jihadism and to radical Islam, but also at times probably entering into conflict because it becomes unavoidable.
When you say we'll be there for 20 or 30 years, in the kind of numbers that we're there
I'm
now?
not talking about troops as much as I'm talking about U.S. national interests, all the elements of national power being used, and troops helping to train indigenous forces. I'm not suggesting those troops would be in Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm talking about the entire region is going to preoccupy at least the first half of the 21st century to a large degree the Department of State and also the Department of Defense, despite obvious interest in the near term in North Korea, despite a growing China and a reemergence of Russia. These transnational actors and also nation states there are going to cause us to be involved in preventing conflict and also dealing with conflict. In terms of the Department of Defense, I think what Secretary Gates is trying to do is he's trying to institutionalize what we have learned after 7 years in Iraq, and that is counterinsurgency and what that means. If you look at the Department of Defense and where it spends its money, most of that revolves around, one, paying for people, which is 70 cents on the dollar. So that's significant in itself, and in terms of the amount of discretion you have after that is obviously not a lot. And then it involves major programs, and those programs usually surround tanks, ships, and airplanes. And huge defense industry in support of it, the best defense industry in the world, quite frankly. But what he's trying to do is institutionalize the low end of warfare in terms of the organization, the doctrine, the training for it, the language adaptability, the cultural adaptability, and also an equipping strategy, which is not that expensive by comparison to the other types of technology that are involved. But everything, as we know, in this world costs money, and that will cost billions. It just won't cost the same as it would to build a $5 billion carrier. The other thing that's happening, when you look at this warfare, I mean, it's always designed to achieve political objectives, whether a force is invading a country to seize that country and using conventional means to do it, or an element inside a country is trying to regain control of the country, which they formerly had, a la Saddam Hussein, who began the insurgency in Iraq, or the Taliban, who have started the insurgency in Afghanistan. Both of them are seeking to regain, both of them were trying to regain control and power. The political objective is obvious. The means that they were using is a low end of warfare to do it. In the one case, in Taliban, they don't have a choice. They don't have any other means. In Saddam's case, he certainly had a standing army, but he knew it was no match for the military that the United States had, so he was willing to give it up, trade that for another form of warfare, which in the long run he thought he could win because he would break the American people's will, protract the war, and in the end we would probably leave. That eventually blew up in his face. The way you characterize the counterinsurgency aspect of it in terms of its application, it is very different. When we're fighting wars, as you know them, conventional wars, against other militaries, the center of gravity for that war is always the enemy. It's military. And that's what we focus on. We take a very rational approach to try to destroy that military using integration of combat power. In a counterinsurgency, the center of gravity actually is not the insurgent or the terrorist. The center of gravity are the people themselves. And that is a very different application of the use of military force, because every time you pull a trigger, or you desire to pull a trigger against the enemy, it must be against the backdrop of what is the expense of this for the people that we are trying to protect here and whose quality of life we're trying to affect over the long run. And therefore, it changes the character and nature of operations for the military rather dramatically. And you can see that having played out right now in Afghanistan and the concern about civilian casualties. That is a reality that the military has to deal with. The second thing is that a lot of the characteristics of that form of warfare are largely non-kinetic. Kinetic has a certain importance, and you have to hold this horrific behavior liable for the protagonists that are here. But you also have to work on other things like governance, reconstruction, development, and connection to the people and essential services as complementary to achieving security.
I want to get back to a lot of what you said there, but first I want to ask Congresswoman Harman. You're the only person on this panel who actually has to deal directly with the people, with the voters. And you talk with them all the time. You know what they're thinking. The people in government don't have to do that. People like me don't do that very often either. So if you look at the way the counterinsurgency is defined, not only the way that General Keane did, but also in the field manual that General David Petraeus wrote, he talks about wars that go on for a very long time, a decade or more, in which there is no, there is no surrender treaty at the end of it. The definition of victory isn't all that clear. One mistake might nullify 100 good things that you're doing in the place. My question is this a style of warfare that's suitable to the United States? Are the American people going to support spending tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars a year, losing young men and women, deploying troops that is an all-volunteer force, with endless cycles of deployment, for years on end with no tangible end at the end of it, maybe? Is this a style of warfare that's suitable to American culture and politics?
Well, let me roll back a little
Sure.
before I answer that and say that I think on 9/10/2001, most Americans, most members of Congress, and most members of the military, I don't want to offend Jack because he's very sophisticated in the way that he thinks about this, did not really understand the set of threats against us. I remember on that day having lunch with a fellow named Jerry Bremer, L. Paul Bremer, who became our first viceroy in Iraq, but he had been the chair of a congressionally mandated study on terrorism in which I participated. And we made a set of recommendations and predicted a major attack on U.S. soil coming from this sort of pickup set of actors. And we had lunch on 9/10/2001 wondering why no one was paying attention. Then came 9/11, and everyone was paying attention. But we had a huge deficit in terms of our understanding of these threats. I think everyone would agree. And the counterinsurgency doctrine that Jack just described really well, hope you were all listening carefully, wasn't fully developed until 2004. I'm talking now about 2001. And that was after we were already mired down, I would say, in Iraq, that we began to understand how we could do this clear, hold, build strategy, which would get us to some success. I don't know about the word success, but would enable there to be some stability there. So I think we had a huge deficit in understanding the threats. To borrow something from Sidney Harman, the threats are digital and we're analog. And I'm sure Michael agrees with this. They're transnational. The people involved in these radical movements are agile and nimble, and one of the big ironies is they use the most advanced technology to try to take us back to the 7th century. But catching up with this has been extremely hard. So now segue to Congress, which my colleague Diana DeGette, whom I see in the audience, and I work in and toil in every day. Congress works on 2-year cycles. Most people in Congress were completely unfamiliar with the Muslim religion and most of the subtleties involved in some of these terror movements. And I think that Congress has taken a while to develop a level of sophistication in dealing with threats. Meanwhile, out in the public, the people who call us every day, at least in the early years after 2001, remembered Vietnam badly and really had no idea what all this was. Saw Iraq going badly, which it was for quite a while, and the reaction was extremely negative. Now we are, I think, in a better place. I think the change in strategy in Iraq, even though it will be difficult to achieve less violence, at least in Baghdad, is a very good thing. I think I don't know if it's called a surge, whatever we're doing in Afghanistan, Jack would know what we're technically calling it, is the insertion of troops on a short-term basis.
The slogan has not yet been devised.
In Helmand, is in order to do what Jack was describing, which is to protect the population and get to a point where there's good governance in that area, is something that I think a lot of people in Congress and out in the country support. So it's a kind of long-winded answer, but I think we've all had to grow and learn together. And my final comment, though, is I think it's necessary to ask every time, what does this have to do with the United States? That doesn't mean that I am an isolationist and don't care about the rest of the world. But before we spend our blood and treasure, we have to understand what U.S. interests we're protecting. And my answer to that is that I believe, and I believed it on 2/10/2001, I believe it now. I believe that the intent of some of these groups is to harm the West, inflict maximum damage on innocent populations, and one of their intended targets is the United States. There are terror cells abroad, and there are terror cells here, and if they could pull off, that's quite beautiful. If they could pull off something, they would. I think we have made it harder for them to succeed. But so my answer to that question is, what does this have to do with us is, we don't want there to be terror sanctuaries around the world where operatives, either foreign operatives or American operatives, can be trained and then can travel here on either valid or forged documents and harm us.
This segues very nicely to Michael Chertoff, who was the director of Homeland Security. What is the relationship between this kind of subject and Homeland Security? For example, people talk about we cannot allow Afghanistan or certain parts of Pakistan to become a safe haven for terrorists. At the same time, you know, there might be certain apartment buildings in Hamburg or the outskirts of Paris, which not only might be, but have been safe havens for certain kinds of terrorist operations. So how do you see, in terms of making, well, I guess it's a dual question in a way, how does what you have been focusing on fit into counterinsurgency, military operations, and so forth, and vice versa? And where would you put the priorities? If your job is to protect the U.S. homeland from attack, how would you rank, you know, fighting off the Taliban in Afghanistan, say?
Well, I guess I would make three observations. First, I agree. I think Jane has posed the question properly. What is the relationship between what happens over there and over here? And I would argue that on September 11th didn't change it, but it stripped away the old encrusted view of the world, which was there's an away game and a home game. You know, it's remarkable to think that between the War of 1812 and September 11th, 2001, there was never an attack against the continental United States by a foreign power or anybody acting transnationally. The closest we came was Pearl Harbor. That means that every war we fought from 1812 to 2001 was either a civil war, domestic war, or, again, with the possible exception of World War II, which was launched with an attack, was an optional war. We were not actually physically attacked. Our interests may very well have been attacked, but we as a country were not physically impaired. What happened in 2001 is it stripped away the idea that we were outside of history and that we could pick and choose which away games we want to play. And I think the hard lesson everybody learned in 2001 is if matters left untended globally will be felt in the United States. We can't opt out, and the ocean will not protect us anymore. So having stripped away that old distinction between the away game and the home game, the question is, what is the peril that we face? And here I would argue that, again, I think this has been brewing since the end of the Cold War. It is a struggle in the largest sense between the forces of order and the forces of disorder. The forces of disorder are certainly represented by Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and other terrorist groups, but it also reflects very sophisticated transnational criminal groups and those groups that straddle the two. And because of the combination of a networked world and a highly leveraged destructive technology, it is now possible for non-state actors to inflict the kind of damage on the security of the world that we used to think was reserved only to state actors. So that has created a different set of challenges. So the third point is, what does that mean for us? What it means for us is that all the old categorical distinctions between military, law enforcement, overseas, home, kinetic, non-kinetic, all those really don't mean very much anymore. All of the tools have to be applied in the right context against these threats, which is why it is of critical importance to us what happens with the Taliban in Afghanistan, because if there's a safe haven there, and if there are laboratories where people can experiment with weapons of mass destruction, anthrax, or chemical weapons, we can very well feel the impact of that over here. Likewise, things that we do over here are going to have an impact overseas. So to me, what is required is, it's almost above a strategy. It's almost like a meta strategy of understanding how all of the tools of order, military, civilian authorities, but also the private sector, come together to work in a partnership to deal with the forces of disorder.
Okay, Mike McConnell, all the things that have been said so far demand an incredible level of intelligence and a sophistication of intelligence. Just to take example of Afghanistan, General Petraeus has talked about co-opting some of the tribal leaders, or some of the, I guess somebody called it Taliban with a small t, people who have aligned themselves with the Taliban but don't really share their millenarian goals. It's just for, they want safety, or they want security, or their cousin was killed last week and they've joined an alliance with them. Do we now have, or are we developing properly, the kind of intelligence that gives our leaders and commanders the knowledge of the composition of these tribal elements, what their interests really are, how they might be lured? Much less the kinds of things that Michael Chertoff is talking about, global enterprises. Where are these people in Hamburg who might be threatening us? This might actually broach on things that you can't tell us, but where are we compared with, say, a few years ago, and how much further do we have to go to really, if we are going to do this kind of thing, to get the kind of intelligence that we need to command it intelligently?
Well, Fred, let me frame it by just making a comment that the American public does not like spies. They don't like to think about them. They don't like to embrace them. So if you look at our history, we're never quite ready whenever the time comes. World War II, we were flat-footed. We built it in time. Mm-hmm. We learned to break code. We learned to do human operations, and we contributed to the war effort that historians would argue shortened it 18 months, 2 years. The only time we ever, as a nation, agreed to invest in an intelligence community was the Cold War. And we did pretty well. There's arguments about we missed the economic decline in Russia, or we missed this or missed that. But if you look overall, by and large, Soviet Union could not think about, design, test, or field a weapon system that we didn't know about, understand, and already have countermeasures built for. So we focused the community mostly on a Cold War mindset. Now, post-Cold War, two operative words in Washington, D.C. were peace, dividend. And so if you've tracked the military and the intelligence community investments over that period of time, shortly after the Cold War ended, it declined somewhere on the order of 40%, 35%, something in that nature. Now, bureaucratically, as a community, I believe we failed the nation because we refused to change. We held on to those old concepts, and we tried to do the same job with fewer assets. And the first job for the intelligence community is warning and advising senior leaders. I call it the the courage to speak truth to power, because if you're delivering bad news, you're not the popular member at the table. And so you have to be creative and forceful to deliver the news. Well, I don't think we delivered it adequately. And so 9/11 occurred. Laws were passed. The Department of Homeland Security was created. A new Director of National Intelligence was created. Although I would say in law, a better phrase for that position is a coordinator of national intelligence. Mm-hmm. We do not have a Department of Intelligence. So as the DNI with cabinet rank, not a cabinet officer, but cabinet rank, if I was going to do anything to integrate the community, what I had to do was to get the agreement of 6 department heads. Now, fortunately, we had the right mix, and we did a lot of useful things and so on, but there's tension in that system always. Now, let me try to address your specific question. The community is expensive. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of $47, $48 billion annually. It's a large number of people, about 100,000, and it has changed itself pretty dramatically since 9/11. The thing that we had de-emphasized in the Cold War was human intelligence. We have significantly emphasized that now, and we are much better at it. We have continued to do signals intelligence, migrating from the old process of wireless in World War II and the Cold War to have more of a focus on the wired world now. That's been part of the debate about changing. Our imagery systems are much better, and we have a mindset now that says precision and persistence. You can turn those around, persistent, but whatever you're focused on. With the precision to deliver the information that would allow the kinds of things that General Keane talked about. And let's talk about Iraq for a second. We were flat-footed. We didn't do well early. In the time frame when the strategy changed, the community matured, my community, intelligence community, to the point when we were fighting the insurgents with the increased forces, and the focus had been to capture and hold and build and protect the population. The opposition could not move that we didn't observe. They could not communicate that we did not hear. And we often had human agents that had penetrated the organizations. And so what happened is the increased security, the change of attitude on the part of the Sunnis in Iraq, the ability with persistence and precision to deliver the precise information that was needed by force to attack some of those who were attacking our side, we had great success. Secretary Gates, unique individual, Secretary of Defense now, of course, but he was formerly the Director of Central Intelligence, nominally the same position that I held in a previous life, an intelligence professional. I've listened to him tell 2 presidents that the operational, the world that General Keane represents, the operational intelligence interface has never been better in our history than it is today. So
by that you mean you come up with intelligence, you feed it to the commanders in the field?
Integration, right.
Yep.
Just the same room, the same focus. The objective is to find and locate and to hand off and achieve some military objective or other objective you may be pursuing. So now that we did well in Iraq, the test now is Afghanistan. Different situation, tribal, less communication, less roads and lines and so on.
No cities.
So this is a bigger challenge, and we are better, but we still have a ways to go. But let me just cross the border. Remember, this is more Pashtun than it is Afghan. And when the British drew the line, the Durand line, they drew it down the middle of the Pashtun tribe, with half of it in Afghanistan and half of it in Pakistan. So the challenge for us now as a nation is how do we conduct our affairs in a way that prevents the collapse of Pakistan, a nation of 170 million people, which is being used as a safe haven today to recruit and train, and to go to what Secretary Chertoff was mentioning, to do the investigation with weapons of mass destruction, biological, whatever, to strike back into the United States. So this is a huge challenge, and the new administration has thought it through. They now frame this as the Afghan-Pakistan strategy, and they're trying to think about it more holistically. My community is challenged. We're better, and we are getting more capable as we continue to support the nation's decision makers, whether it's the White House, General Petraeus at sort of the military strategic level, or it's the field commanders that are dealing with the threat face to face.
Okay. This leads, this is all flowing much more naturally than I even expected it would. General Keane, looking at Afghanistan, I mean, everybody says, well, we need to combine all the elements of national power, et cetera, et cetera. But really, as a practical matter, for the foreseeable future, that means the military. I mean, theoretically, the State Department should be doing X, Y, and Z, but they don't have the personnel, the trained personnel to do this. They're not going to go into a situation unless there's security first and so forth. So, and the military has gotten very good at doing the kinds of things that maybe civil affairs people should be doing. So looking at this strategy in Afghanistan, which is this clear, hold, and build, which I don't know if everybody is familiar with this term. It means to clear the place of insurgents, to hold on to it, and then to rebuild, to turn the place into at least prosperous enough that the base of support for the insurgents dries up. There's no need for these insurgents to come in anymore. They're doing fine on their own. Even given the extra forces that the Obama administration has put in, is there enough to really pull this off in Afghanistan? And I guess a prior question to that might be, what really is the goal here? What might be defined as victory or as sustainable operations, or however you want to define it? And then really, I know there's no hard math to this, even though some people like to pretend there is, but do we have enough? Or is the Afghanistan army building fast enough to step in where we can?
Yeah.
That's a long question.
That's a great question, and it's certainly very, very germane. I'll be, very direct in my answers here, and we absolutely do not have enough, nor do we have plans to have enough. And that's one of the problems. Now, why am I saying that? Look, we're Americans, and characteristic of us is we're very flexible people, and therefore your military is also very flexible. Maybe not compared to a civilian in a private sector organization, but compared to other militaries, we're very operationally adaptive and flexible. And I think that's why we were able to turn around a failed strategy in Iraq for 3 years into a winning strategy. And that failed strategy had certain ingredients in it. It was driven by the desire to have a short war objective. Stand up a regime very quickly politically, train the Iraqi security forces, let them fight this insurgency, and let's get out of there. Never quite communicated to you, the American people, like that, but very much operationalized around those two pillars. And that strategy was fundamentally wrong because it never established security first so that we could make political progress, so that we could make economic progress and economic development, and therefore change the quality of life experience of the people. Fast forward to Afghanistan. Same characteristics of America is operating here. We want to get this thing over, and we want to get it over quickly. And so when you hear things like, well, what we need to do is we need to have better governance, we have to have better reconstruction and better development, and we're going to do that as complementary to what the military's effort is in terms of dealing with the Taliban or the insurgency. And the insurgency in Afghanistan is not homogeneous as it was in Iraq. It's complicated, and that would take up the rest of our time here to explain the various factions that are operating there and what their own goals are. But the fact of the matter is, we have to get security first so that you can make political progress and the kind of reconstruction and developmental progress we want to have. Our tendency is to cheat on the security side of it, as we did in Iraq. And why is that? Well, because that's the commitment of troops. There's significant risk involved in terms of lives, and there's also significant political risk involved in terms of your viewpoint as to how that war is going and the very nature of the war in terms of its protractedness. It takes time to bring it to resolution. So there'll be a tendency to do it with less, and we'll try to shore it up in this other area. Our experience tells us that will not work. Even if you set it aside, listen to this for a second, there's a debate about the goals in Afghanistan. On the high end, the most extreme end, rebuild the nation and have a flourishing democracy. Even the Bush administration certainly did not want to do that. On the very low end, just in terms of a strategic goal, just deny Afghanistan to terrorists from which they could have a sanctuary and attack us from. Makes sense. Just on that very low end. Regardless of all the strategic goals that you would select between the very high end and the low end, and there are many in between, you still have to defeat the insurgency to accomplish any one of those goals. You cannot cheat on it. But our tendency will be, if we have a lesser strategic goal, therefore, that translates into less application of troops, and we can shore that up doing other things. That, I believe, is the road we're creeping down right now in Afghanistan. And that will not give us the kind of answer we want. It will protract the war unnecessarily, eventually evaporate political support in the country. In my judgment, the Afghanistan forces, which are now sitting around 85, 90,000, projected to go to 135,000, need to go to some place in the neighborhood of 400,000 to get the force ratios right. We tripled the size of the Iraq force in Iraq, and it can be done. In January 2007 to December of 2007, unreported largely to the American people, while the surge was operating, and we spent the 6 months of that year increasing the force by 35 to 50,000 as part of the surge force, we put on the street from the Iraqi security forces 125,000 that truly made a difference. And the goals that we have in Afghanistan, which are currently under review, are inadequate. And also the amount of time that it may take to get there are also inadequate. And it makes sense, the more of them that you have, the less of us that you need. That's a reality. The stopgap, while we wait for the Afghan National Security Forces to reach maturity in size and also in quality, is what? It sure isn't NATO, because they're not going to help us any more than they currently are. And in my judgment, that mission has largely a failed one from NATO in terms of what they have not been able to do, and more specifically, not what they've not been willing to do. And that's just calling a spade a spade. And the second thing is the stopgap has to come from who then? U.S. forces. That's all under review by a new commander. I would imagine in time, in a number of weeks from now, he'll probably put on a table a requirement for more U.S. troops in Afghanistan for the reasons I just stated. And I believe it's essential if we want to win there, and winning, in my judgment, is a stable government, no sanctuary for the Al-Qaeda, and some normalcy in the lives of the people that is taking place there. And you must understand the relationship of Afghanistan to Pakistan, which is a considerably more serious problem, as Mike pointed out: size of population, nuclear weapons, a deteriorating state right before our eyes, socially, politically, and economically, an insurgency raging in the country, aided and abetted by the Al-Qaeda. And it is the Al-Qaeda's number one central objective, is bringing down the regime in Pakistan and aiding the Taliban insurgents in the prosecution of that. And we have genuine national security interests in not letting that happen and destabilizing the entire region, and most specifically, ever permitting weapons to get in the hands of the radicals. I mean, feel assured that in our government, I'm confident that even if the Taliban were able to seize the capital, if necessary, we would seize the weapons to protect them.
Do you want to jump in on something?
I would. I don't have a military background, but I have been steeped in these issues for almost 2 decades in Congress, and Congress hasn't always come at these issues in a very rational, bipartisan way. I think no one has missed it. But a lot a number of members in Congress try to think deeply about this now, especially post-2001. And Jack, I really respect your enormous experience, but I think I see this differently. I see the problem, and it is a huge problem. I agree with you that it's a problem in Afghanistan and Pakistan particularly, as a problem of their governance. And if their governance doesn't get better, no matter how many troops we commit, I don't think we get to any level of success. And the Clear Hold Build strategy does contemplate governance, as Fred said, that offers a more attractive alternative than joining the Taliban or pick your favorite insurgent group. But I think the leadership in both countries is extremely weak. And I think we missed an opportunity to help generate a real election in Afghanistan where President Karzai, who I think has huge gaps in leadership, could have been opposed by others who might or might not have been better. It would have been a democratic election. But now, essentially, the conclusion of August's election is a foregone conclusion. And Karzai and his network, including his half-brother Walid Karzai, provide, in my view, inadequate governance. And so even if we insert more troops in Afghanistan, which Jim Jones said today we are not doing through this year, and maybe we'll add 10,000 next year, but even if we did that, I think it would be problematic. So where do I come out? I think that the U.S. can't do all this. We just passed in Congress a $100 billion supplemental, essentially to fund our exit strategy in Iraq and the commitment of more troops in Afghanistan and non-military aid in Pakistan, all of which I think are important, and I certainly voted for it. It was controversial, but I voted for it. In the future, military expenses like this, except for true emergencies, will be on budget. They won't be in supplementals. That means that members of Congress and the public will have to weigh the costs of large additional troops against health care, education, and so forth. And it will be a very tough fight to see where our priorities are. And so let me just conclude by saying that I think Michael and I see the threats to America the same. We worked closely together in his years as Homeland Security Secretary, where I think he did a very, very good job. And I think his successor, Janet Napolitano, is doing a very good job as well. But to protect America, we have to have very focused, limited objectives abroad. And those objectives have to be to prevent terror sanctuaries from reemerging in Afghanistan and Pakistan, to make sure that Iran, North Korea, very hard challenges are managed as well as we can, because again, those are states, one has nuclear weapons, one is almost there, and they could sell them, trade them quite easily to bad guys. But we have to manage that, but we cannot, I don't think there will be the support for it, and I don't think it will succeed, insert large numbers of additional troops in any of these places. And finally, let me just say to Mike McConnell, I agree with him that our intelligence community is doing much better. It's been hard. I think we do better at tactical intelligence, that is providing, state-of-the-minute guidance to the warfighter or the drone or whatever, the airplane, et cetera, than we do at strategic intelligence, taking a longer look and figuring out where China's going or what those wackos in North Korea are really thinking. We're not as good at that, but we're doing much better. And as one of the architects of the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004, the goal was not just a coordinator, but a commander, a joint command structure over 16 intelligence agencies, much the way we reorganized the military under Goldwater-Nichols in the 1980s. I think that it's still a work in progress, but I think the improved intelligence products show that we're headed in the right direction.
Okay, we're going to talk up here for about 10 more minutes, then open it up to the public for Q&A. But let me just ask a question based on what, and anybody feel free to answer this. I think you're right, Congresswoman, that no matter what the military requirements might be, there's only so much that we're going to do. And part of that is, even if there was a willingness to do more than that, we don't have that many troops. I mean, if you take the size of the Army and the Marines, Subtract those that are permanently deployed in places like Korea and still in Europe and in the continent of the United States. If you allow for the principle where you spend 12 months deployed and then 12 months at home, and then some training beyond that, and then you allow for some attrition of our troops in addition, we don't end up with much. The number of troops that we had in Iraq at the most was the maximum number that we could put in Iraq. There really was no way to put much more. The surge was 21,000, 25,000 troops because that's what we had that was available. So let me throw this out. Number one, is there any chance, and I'm not saying this is whether we should or shouldn't, is the idea of a military draft still completely off the table? Is it even more absurd to contemplate than doing means testing for Social Security or something? And second, what about the idea of, if NATO isn't going to help us out on here, and there's a lot of reasons why that's the case, there are other countries that share our interests in this. Is there any way to do an alliance of convenience in Afghanistan? And would it have any effect in any event? And I open both of those questions up to...
I'll jump on that. In terms of a draft, I think I could safely speak for most in the military that, particularly the older folks who had been part of this conscript military, that we would prefer not to go back to that. The United States military achieved a preeminence in the world in the latter part of the 20th century, largely due to the fact that we were made up of volunteers who truly are committing a portion of their life to this, for a term of enlistment or possibly even a career of service. And what that means to those who are leading them is dramatically different in terms of the amount of training, skill development that you can develop, with people who are committed to being there, and also the level of sacrifice that is required. So most of us would rather not go back to the kind of draft that we had, given the kind of emergencies that we face today. We don't see that as necessary. In terms of Afghanistan, sometimes we throw things around loosely, and even on the plus side of troop increase in Afghanistan, I would believe that number would be about half of what we ever required in Iraq. And I don't want to speak for General McChrystal because he's going through an assessment as a new commander, and I don't know what that assessment will actually conclude, but I would, on the high end of it, I don't see it being rather significant. Now, is there stress and strain on the military, particularly the ground forces, these last 7-8 years? Yes, certainly there are. And it's pretty remarkable because the character of that sacrifice, in my mind, when I think about the history of the country, you never have so few been doing something for so long, for so many, the many being us.
Excuse me, I just wanted to clarify.
At significant sacrifice to themselves, and it's pretty remarkable in of itself. All that said, they have enormous resiliency, and they are being stressed, as you can tell by some of the fractures in their families. But that force is whole. It performs to a very high standard. Its morale is very high. Its connection and commitment to the missions that are assigned are significant. They have a dogged determination to succeed, which exceeds anything that I experienced in my 37 years of service, the latter part of which was post 9/11. And it has to deal with the post 9/11 world for them, because we spent most of our lives dealing with problems around the world, indirectly related to national security or sometimes related to it. In the minds of the military who are in faraway places, it's directly related to the American people in a post 9/11 world, which drives the motivation, drives the sense of commitment. So my answer is that yes, more troops would be available. We're going to bring our forces down rather dramatically in Iraq, as you're well aware of. I think we can manage the stress on the force. I also believe we should grow the ground forces somewhat larger than what it currently is. It's probably not politically supportable, but I do think that is an acceptable answer doing it and not go back to any form of conscription.
I just, again, to stand back a little bit and put this in a broader frame, I agree with Jack that in all kinds of ways, the first responsibility of government is security. If you don't secure your population, everything else you do is besides the point. And that's true, of course, in the United States as well. This is not just an Afghan-Pakistan problem. Take Somalia. Somalia is a great microcosm of a new series of emerging challenges. Now, it is connected to Afghanistan because you have a group of extremists, Al-Shabaab, which does have links back to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and yet they also have been fighting against the forces of order since at least the early 90s. We've been doing this for 20 years. The piracy issue is now a serious problem for shipping, so it's affecting our global economy. It is creating a training ground for Somalis who could eventually go back to Europe or even the U.S. and decide they want to carry out activities. Let's move further west. Let's look at South and Central America. I was told, it was kind of a startling fact, I was told by the prosecutor in Argentina who's investigating the bombing in 1994 of the synagogue in Buenos Aires, that since the 1980s, this is, again, almost 30 years ago, the Iranians have deliberately and systematically infiltrated their agents and Hezbollah agents into South America in order to give them a platform from which to operate in this hemisphere. And when I say their agents in Hezbollah, I'm also underlining the fact that here you have a state that on the one hand is, in my view, seeking to obtain a nuclear capability, and yet at the same time it is partnered with probably the most formidable terrorist organization we've seen in 20 years. And finally, even look at our border with Mexico, where you have increasing problems with very sophisticated transnational criminal groups. What does this mean? It means the issue of stability globally is not just going to be Afghanistan and Pakistan, although that's part of it. It means that when we think about the tools we bring to get stability, it's not going to only be the military, because we don't have enough military to do all of these things, and it won't fit everywhere. It means we're going to have to look at other kinds of stabilizing forces, whether it's the border patrol, whether it's enhanced capabilities with the intelligence community, whether it's the ability to partner with countries around the world. So to me, this comes back to the point I made originally. We still tend to look at this problem through a series of categories and boxes that we built in the 20th century, where we say this is a Defense Department problem, this is a FBI problem, this is a local police problem. And I don't think we can do that anymore, because I think what the adversary will do is move around. If we start to succeed in Afghanistan, they're going to migrate to Somalia, or they're going to wind up doing something in South America. If we push the Iranians, we have to be concerned about whether Hezbollah is going to retaliate in some way. So we cannot afford any longer to look at the question of what our forces are and our capabilities through the lens of individual tasks. We have really got to look 360 degrees at this, I think, brand new 21st century landscape.
So using the language that you used at the beginning of this round table or long table or whatever, looking at this as the forces of order versus the forces of disorder. In places like Somalia or Mexico or whatever, are there more things that we could practically do to shore up the forces of order within those countries, or are we at this point going to have to focus more on battling against the forces of disorder?
I'll give you two examples. Take Somalia and the piracy issue there. You know, some shipping owners say they'd like to have the U.S. military or ideally NATO patrol the Indian Ocean or put their forces on merchant vessels. I don't think that's going to happen. So what do? We're going to have to empower them to protect themselves. That means we're going to have to change some of the legal rules. Right now, the legal and liability rules make it very difficult, almost impossible for a ship owner to have the kind of capability on a ship that would protect the ship against pirates or attacks. We're going to have to change that if we're going to partner with the private sector in terms of doing that.
You mean international legal codes?
Right,
yeah.
Capability. Mexico. This is an area where we can't go into Mexico. No one's advocating that, but we're going to have to continue to push more capability into Mexico and then do things on our side of the border to make life difficult for those gangs. And one of the things we did when I was secretary is we used to, a lot of these criminal groups kept their assets in the U.S. and their families in the U.S. and they operated in northern Mexico. And what we would do is we would target their assets and their families and go after them using some of our capabilities, the criminal justice capabilities, to put pressure on them. But again, there'll be risks involved in that too. So you got to look at this whole thing 360, which I think we're beginning to do, but it's been done on an ad hoc basis, and it has not been done systematically.
Does anybody want to?
Can I build on that just a little bit? I just want to make an observation for those in the audience. If we had been having this discussion in July 2001, this would be labeled the comedy hour.
Yeah.
So one event happened, and here we are years later debating it. This group generally agrees on the threat because we focused on it, we think about it, and so on. What we're disagreeing on is a risk. And once you don't have alignment on an agreement on the risk, then now you're arguing priorities, more of these or more of those or whatever. I would just want to posit that one event will change this debate again, and that one event is going to be a weapon of mass destruction. There's a greater than 50% likelihood it's going to happen in the next 5 years. That's the intelligence community's estimate. We didn't pick a place because we couldn't pin it down. And when we talk about weapon of mass destruction, it's usually chemical, biological, or nuclear. Nuclear is less likely because there are more controls. Biological is more likely because there are fewer controls. So I can see a scenario where someone achieves the ability to amass enough anthrax to cause it to infiltrate across the United States in the mail system or UPS or whatever distribution system they would choose, and it would be a very dramatic impact on the nation. And this debate would now be arguing again about the priorities for finding those perpetrators and
I think it's not just the threat and the risk, but also the resources. I mean, if something is high risk, so what you're saying maybe is that if there is another incident, the resources.
Well, as a democracy, we always are reactive, not proactive. Everything that we've established that we consider a part of our daily lives, Federal Reserve, Social Security.
Just 1 minute, then I think we have to go to the audience.
That was a result of a crisis.
But it's not just risk, it's managing risk. What are the best strategies for managing risk? And I think we may differ a bit, but I like Michael's formulation about 360. That was my formulation about digital versus analog, which derives from Sidney Harman's formulation about a lot of other things. But at any rate, I think that we have gotten better at that. One size does not fit all. I mean, these groups are not one size. In Mexico, one of the things that's going well is the government there is highly effective and very courageous. In contrast to the governments in Afghanistan and Pakistan, at least in my view. Pakistan's getting a bit stronger, but it's taken a huge amount of work to get Pakistan to confront the indigenous Taliban threat. On Hezbollah, I agree that there is a foothold and has been for 30 years in Latin America, but some governments, I was recently in Brazil, and the Brazilian government does not view Hezbollah as a threat. They say it's not a terror organization, and they have no proof that it is even in Brazil. Well, duh, sure it is. And it's, of course, in Argentina because it actually attacked in Argentina. And because of the problems in Mexico, there may be a clear path to the U.S. Using some of the drug cartels as the muscle in the terror attacks. So there really are huge risks. How we manage them is what the test will be.
Okay. So there are two.
Fred, let me just add one last
Okay,
point.
but there are two microphones. I don't know where they are. I can't see, but you can start lining up there.
Since Mike McConnell mentioned anthrax, and this is an example of how broadly we need to think about the problem. The real solution to an anthrax attack in this country is going to be the ability to recover by distributing the countermeasures which exist. And that is not a military problem, and it's not a police problem. It is a public health problem. So this really comes down to the kind of the nub of the issue I think we face. The public health community in this country still is not really engaged in the process of dealing with the issue of security from the standpoint of a biological attack. In fact, it's not even really that engaged with pandemic flu planning, which if we actually could fully get them engaged at the local level would help a lot with the kind of.
Although we did pretty well.
We've done pretty well.
So we've done
well at the national level.
We have to be out of here at 10:15.
So you got to look at all the tools.
Whoops.
So let's start over here.
Pat Patterson. This is not my field, but I really want to thank you all for an excellent presentation. And Secretary Chertoff, I think, in my view, you've put your finger right on it. It has to be 360 coming at it from all angles. Coming from all angles. Thank you for a good presentation. What I'm hearing, in my very simple way, is that we do not have sufficient troops in Afghanistan or in Pakistan to do the job by ourselves unless we get good governance out of these countries. And to me, it seems that history is not on our side on this. As the general pointed out, there's a great deal of complexity in the resistance here. And so what if we don't get good governance? What happens then?
That's a good question.
Look, in my view, when we look at Afghanistan, we should look at it pretty harshly and realistically in terms of what our strategic objectives are. This is a country that has a very high illiteracy rate, and trades and its primary commodity is an opium trade. It's its major source of income. It's relatively an uneducated class of people. They're wonderful people if you spend any time around them, and they're willing to fight for things they believe in, and they have an enormous strength of character. But in my own view, if we fast forward 25, 30 years, and we look at Afghanistan, it'll have an opium trade that it's trafficking in. It'll have a relatively uneducated class of people, and it'll have a very high illiteracy rate. And the central government will not be strong enough in connecting to its people in a way that makes sense to us. So some of the goals there, I think it's reasonable that they be limited to a certain degree in terms of stabilizing the country. They have a history of a weak central government. We're probably not going to change that culture. Iraq had a history of a strong central government. We certainly would never be able to change that culture. It is appropriate that the government should connect to its people better than it is, and we should improve on the governance. I'm not suggesting we're not. We will do that, and we are trying to do that. But all I'm trying to put the template down, that if you don't get security, none of the other really matters. And that's been proven, and we have evidence for that. And so what is the requirement to get security? And you can take a somewhat rationalized approach to what that requirement is. It may be unacceptable in terms of political will, political objectives, for an administration to deal with that. And those are choices a president and his team certainly have to make, and those are reasonable choices that they have to make in terms of what are their priorities.
I think maybe the thing to do is to have maybe 3 people ask questions. I'm guessing that they'll be related in some way, and that then the panel can deal with all 3. And I'll make sure that if one of them gets side-laid, I'll make somebody confront it. So maybe over here.
My question is slightly unrelated, but given changes in warfare and rises in numbers of insurgent groups, do you think that the roles of transnational organizations that try crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity, like the ICC or ICJ, do you foresee a change in the roles of those organizations concerning combating these insurgent groups?
Okay. Over here?
Yes, Russia has just requested a neutrality in cyberspace, and the United States has declined. Is mutually assured destruction our strategy for managing cyberspace warfare?
That's a good one. And over here?
Thank you. I'm just curious, how can we effectively deal with this issue if there's an entire tier of protagonists who have full immunity? The Supreme Court just the other day ruled that no action could be taken against 4 Saudi princes and Saudi Arabia regarding actions brought against them with regard to 9/11. And if indeed, the reason being that they have sovereign immunity. Let me put that in there. And if indeed there is sovereign immunity on this issue, for that reason, for that event, the flip side then of sovereign immunity, and given the fact that these people are so clearly associated with the Saudi government, is the flip side not then that this was an act of war?
Okay, well, my strategy didn't work out. Those questions were completely unrelated. But so let's try to deal with them very quickly. First of all, the first question, the role of transnational organizations dealing with crimes against humanity, do they have a role in helping us deal with those kinds of international criminals? Do you foresee a role for these groups?
I think the first and third question are similar. I personally don't think that use of court activity as a way of dealing with the kinds of things we're talking about is a major function. I think that indicting bin Laden is going to have zero impact, and suing him is going to have zero impact. I mean, at the margin, it might have some benefit. I think what we're talking here is a much more non-legal, and I didn't say illegal, but non-legal in terms of its approach.
And what about cyber terrorism? Or did you want to?
Oh, well, I think you were going to talk about the Supreme Court decision too,
Yeah,
right?
Well, likewise with the issue of sovereign immunity. I mean, I think suing over 9/11 is at the margin. Maybe it's beneficial. That's not where I put my chips, basically.
I think that cybersecurity is a huge challenge for the United States, not just in the private sector, but obviously in the public sector, and especially our defense networks. And we're doing okay, but not great. And it's not just having the technical capability to get on top of this, but it is also the huge civil liberties implications of Big Brother. Right. And nobody has mentioned that yet, including me. But as we go forward, if Mike is right that after the next attack, these issues will sort out more easily, before the next attack, if any, hopefully not, we need to sort them out. I mean, I don't think security and liberty are a zero-sum game. I think you either get more of both or less of both, and that's what Ben Franklin said 220 years ago.
But what about the idea of it?
So I think we need to be much more aggressive and assertive about going after this challenge. It's not just cyber warfare. It is the whole issue of security, which is more than just thinking about it in terms of warfare.
But what about this proposal by Russia to have...
Let me try to speak to that, Fred. It's not an issue of mutually assured destruction in cyberspace. It's an issue of mutually assured defense in cyberspace. We are more dependent, much more dependent than Russia on cyber networks and so on. The Russians are very, very aggressive in not only exploitation, but the ability to attack through cyberspace. So they perceived a tactical or strategic advantage to make that proposal. The United States chose not to accept that proposal, but as a nation and as a globe, we're going to have to think through a higher level of defense in the global networks that govern finance and commerce and production and so on. So this is an area that the nation's going to struggle with over the next few years to get the policies right, the strategy right, and ultimately it's going to have to be a legal framework that the American people will approve of and vote for, because we're going to be balancing the ability to operate in cyberspace with forces that have missions to collect information in a foreign context that will have to harness that information to protect in a domestic context. It goes to what Secretary Chertoff was talking about. We've had this world divided by foreign, domestic, law enforcement, and so on, and we have to integrate across all those various players.
So over here.
For the last 7.5 years, those people who are charged with keeping us safe have been doing that. I mean, they kept us safe. My question is there anything that has been, besides what's in the news, of course, that you were doing for the last 7.5 years, which you're no longer doing?
I think what we were doing for the last 7 years, and successfully, much of it not in the press, at least my current reading of it is we're doing more of it, not less of it.
Did you have anything in mind with that question?
No, it's just that we hear about 2 or 3 issues that are in this press, and there are thousands of things that are being done, I'm sure, or were being done.
Subsets, I think, and the larger issue, I think there's been, as we transition administrations, I think, frankly, there's been a lot of continuity. One of the major principles, certainly, was to take our entire element of national power on the offense in a post-9/11 world. And no longer, particularly in the region of the world where that attack came from, was our policy one of containment. Our policy was one of confrontation. And that policy, maybe not expressed quite as direct as that, is what it truly is. We're still on the offense. And as a result of that, it has a direct impact in terms of the security of the United States. And the Secretary here, and certainly Mike, are very much aware of the number of and kinds of things that were stopped as a result of intel apparatus and police operations and the rest of it. But in general, staying on the offense is a very important principle of this, so that you do not permit one transnational group, Al-Qaeda Central, to reorganize its global reach, which it does not have now, and which it clearly had at that time. And it's much more challenged to have that from an operational perspective. So that in of itself is very important to us. I'm sure other people can connect.
While I agree that we did many things well and we have kept the country safe, I also think we made some big mistakes. And I think governing on what's called the dark side was a big mistake. I think we could have done many of the things we did differently. Cutting Congress in, having clearer legal frameworks around our policies, and living more by our values. And we're doing some course corrections now, the Obama administration is, and I applaud that. There are going to be some bumps and starts. It's not going to be easy to close Guantanamo, obviously. But it will be closed, and we will find a better system, I think, for processing those.
We have time for one quick question followed by a quick answer.
Obviously, the United States has been doing a lot in fighting terrorism, but do you guys believe we can be truly successful if the other world superpowers aren't willing to work as hard as we are in terms of military support or any other type of support?
We would be more successful if they would be more helpful. Now, when one of those weapons of mass destruction happens in one of those countries, I think we'll have more willing participation. But we have no choice but to continue the effort.
Okay, with that, I want to thank our panel for the problems ahead of us. Okay, good, yeah, thanks.